Good morning, everybody. My name is Ettore Greco. I am the Executive Vice President of the Wto International Affairs, Istituto Affari Internazionali, and the head of the Institute Program on Multilateralism and Global Governance. And I'll be chairing and moderating this meeting. So as you may see, there's been a slight change in the agenda. The meeting is part of a project entitled The Role of G20 in Promoting Global Governance, Challenges and Opportunities of the Italian Presidency of G20. Essentially, the goal of the project is to examine the state of play of the G20 agenda and make recommendations and proposals that can help the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and particularly, of course, the Prime Ministerial Office, to promote the G20 agenda, to advance the key points of the agenda. And of course, I would like to express a special thanks to our partners, and particularly the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also the Compagnia di Sanpaolo, Turin, for supporting this project. They have been from the very beginning very active partners in defining the goals of the project and then help us develop it. The theme, specific theme of today's meeting is the reform of the WTO, but more broadly, what we have called the challenges of global trade governance. So we would like to discuss the key questions of the WTO. Of course, we can speak, I think, of the WTO crisis against the background of major trends also in trade partners, and taking into account the positions of the major actors, particularly those represented within the G20. And let me also express special thanks to the experts who have accepted to serve as panelists. So without further ado, let me give the floor first to Armando Barucco, Head of Analysis and Planning Unit at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs International Cooperation. And I'd like to underline that in particular in developing this project, we've been in close contact and cooperated closely with the planning unit of the ministry. Please, Armando, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ettore, and thanks to Yai and all the panelists and the author of the excellent paper for this meeting. I try to be as short as possible, considering that in this kind of event, speaking more than 3-4 minutes, it's a very bad choice. So when we go back actually at the moment in which we approved this program, I would say that I don't think that any of us 1 year ago could imagine the kind of situation we were here. And I think it has to do a lot with the quality of the work that Yai is producing, the fact that I read the paper and I find that is even more, I would say, contemporary and close to the situation, even if it cannot actually refer to the current situation. The paper, the analysis, I would say even the recommendation are actually absolutely in line with what is happening. And I have just 3-4 key points that I want to stress that perhaps are a bit outside the specific scope of the discussion, but I think are important. You know, Johnny Camberry wrote recently that the earliest victim of COVID crisis was multilateralism and international cooperation. And I would say that what we witnessed, especially in the first week of the COVID crisis in Italy, with the scramble for masks and ventilators and the very poor display of multilateral cooperation, actually showed that there was a lot to do, and that the status of multilateralism and international cooperation, it was really in very dire state. And of course, the same goes for WTO. The crisis of the WTO is very, very old. And in the current scenario is actually that is even worse. At the same time, I must say that what is happening with the COVID crisis opens ways in, actually opens new scenarios in both ways, positive and negative. As most of the policy planning units in the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, of course, we have been asked to interrogate about the scenarios and the trends and what it really means COVID and what kind of world we will have after COVID. And of course, we concur with the most of what has been said, and we identified at least 10 major trends. I won't go through them because it's too long and I don't want actually to waste your time. Nothing particularly original, except for the fact that, of course, we concur with the fact that the COVID is an accelerator of trends of the past years. But what is more dangerous is that COVID is truly a fragilizer. It is making international context and cooperation more fragile. It's making scenarios of crisis and conflicts more fragile. It's making states more fragile, economies more fragile. I will skip the 10 of them that we discussed. I will just focus on one point and I come to the conclusion, because it has a direct impact on what we will discuss in terms of the reform of the WTO, etc. I would say that nobody can dispute that if we have to imagine one single priority, apart of course from the health emergency, that is coming out from the COVID crisis, has to do with the recession, depression to come, and with the social and economic tensions that will arise from that. I don't think there is anybody that can dispute that if we have to think of a major concern and a major priority has to do with the economics. And of course, whatever is coming in terms of social tension, etc. And we are already witnessing what is happening. So, and one thing about the measures that all of us have decided to take into account of these aspects are very legitimate, and it's actually the obvious thing to do. If we look at the suspension of state aid rules in the EU, the identification of strategic sectors, and then the proposal about reconsidering supply chain, and the proposal for onshoring and regionalization of the supply chain. All of this actually have been very, very reasonable thing to discuss and very reasonable proposal. And they all bring to a specific point, that is actually the changing balance between the public sector and the private sector. You know, we have built a union based on the concept of the state as a regulator and the private as an entrepreneur. We are slowly moving towards a system in which the state will more and more become actually an entrepreneur in a lot of very important and strategic sectors. So this has consequences from any point of view, but there is one specific consequence of what is happening that should be worrying for all of us and requires, even in adopting some of the measures, fine-tuning and a lot of attention on the possible long-term consequences. If you look a little bit, but I don't want to enter into subjects that Professor Padoan mastered better than anybody else, but some of the measures and the global narrative that we are developing about the COVID crisis really reminds us of the 30s and the claustrophobic international economic environment that came after the 30s. So, and coming back and coming to my conclusion, if we all agree that the key issue for all of us has to do with the economic depression, recession to come, and the need to relaunch global recovery and global trade as key for relaunching global recovery, we have to be very careful in the kind of rules and the kind of narratives and the kind of state decision and bills that we approve within our member states and within the European Union. And keeping in mind that the key for relaunching the economy and the recovery has to do with actually developing, coming back to a more functioning and effective multilateralism and international cooperation and global trade. And this has, of course, to do with the current dynamic of the China-America and the relationship between the US and China. I don't think any of us has the delusion of thinking that we can help to relaunch global recovery, which is badly needed, especially I would say for the European Union and for countries in the situation of Italy, without a common effort and a common vision from the US, the EU and China. I would say that the EU has surprised, at least for the moment, most of us, has shown a capacity of leadership, and crossing fingers, of course, with what will happen with the recovery fund, but it has shown the ability to actually have a role of leadership in the current crisis. I truly hope that this role of internal leadership that the EU is showing has also an external side. And one of the main aspects of the external projection of what the EU is doing has to do, of course, with the relaunch of the WTO, the reform of the WTO, and with the relaunch of multilateralism and multilateral trade. And I stop here.
Many thanks, Armando, for already having put on the table a lot of very crucial issues, including particularly the huge, far-reaching implication of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially on the economic, but not only on the economic level, but also political and social level, and also for emphasizing the spatial responsibility of Western countries, particularly the EU. These are issues on which I'm sure we are interested in coming back on later on. So I'd like now to give the floor to Piercarlo Padoan, who is Vice President of the Istituto International Affairs. Of course, he's also a member of Parliament and former Ministry of Economy of Italy. Please.
Well, first of all, good morning to everybody, and let me join Ettore Greco in welcoming you to IAI in my capacity as Vice President, and applauding to this initiative, and also thanking all participants for their contribution. And second, to apologize for the fact that I will have to leave soon after I complete my welcoming remarks. This is just another piece of evidence that with the post-COVID world is one where one works much more than in normal times, because the number of meetings that one can arrange is considered to be limitless, which is of course not true because time is there. So it's very demanding, but I think it's also very exciting. Minister Baruch already exposed with lots of details and richness of interesting key questions the scenario. So let me just add a few thoughts and end up with some considerations about the role of Europe, which also Minister Baruch mentioned. Well, first of all, let us remind ourselves that the state of world trade relations and the challenges for the WTO were already on the table before the COVID crisis because of the shift in the quote-unquote political economy of global relations, not just in trade, but also in international relations in a broad sense. And of course, the fact that we, to use some political economy language, we are moving away from multilateralism, although in a post-hegemonic world, to bilateralism makes a lot of difference because it changes, so to speak, the preferences of the countries, preferences on going towards more bilateral or possibly limited regional agreements and moving away from multilateral agreements. This is in itself a challenge to global governance, including the G20, which, as we all recall, was launched in its current form exactly to respond to a global crisis, the previous crisis, the financial crisis, and did a good job in a number of areas and could have done a better job in another number of areas. So first point to be put on the table is where would the global relations, political and economic relations be, even when once we will be out, so to speak, of the threat of a new pandemic. Of course, if one can imagine a world like this. And this has to do with politics, including, of course, the possible or impossible changes in US administration and the role of Europe. I'll come back to that. Second fact, which all of my colleagues are well aware, and Ms. Baruco mentioned, is that the COVID crisis is a game changer from an economic point of view. He mentioned recession. Yes, of course, recession is big. We do not know how big it will be, how long it will last. But also redistribution, reshuffling of power positions. Economists are beginning to understand that the problem with the COVID crisis, the COVID shock, is that it hurts and benefits sectors in a differentiated way by damaging sectors where the role of human proximity is more important, to state the obvious, like tourism, and rewarding those sectors like the web economy at large, which demand for which services has, of course, increased significantly because of the crisis. So we simply have to look at underlying structural trends to understand, or try to understand, what's happening. And international economists, and especially trade economists, are well aware of what that implies. This, of course, also implies not only changes in the global value chains, for instance, but implies impacts on policy preferences and tendencies to more or less regionalism as a solution to a weakening multilateralism. This is not new, it's probably new in its dimension. So this is my second point. My third point and final point is the role of the EU, which, again, it has been mentioned that the EU is going through very significant changes in governance, in strategy, in the way the EU looks at the world. And we are all watching closely the extent of negotiations about the recovery fund, or rather next generation EU framework, which has a lot of ambition, which goes beyond money and the redistribution of resources, although it is motivated also in large part with the fear that the crisis will leave Europe much more fragmented than before. But there is one element which I'd like to offer as an element of consideration in discussion, which is the fact that slowly Europe is moving towards a stronger economic union, including through symptoms of fiscal union coming up, but also setting up the possibility of having economic instruments as a way of generating own resources for the budget. I'm thinking about possible web tax, border tax, and so forth, which are possible if Europe as a single global actor is strengthened. So my point, and this is where I finish, is that one of the consequences of the COVID crisis could be to strengthen the global role of the EU, out of necessity, but also out of innovation, institutional innovation. And this, of course, would act as a counteracting force to those elements towards unilateralism, which were present in the system even before the COVID crisis. So thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a very fruitful seminar.
Many, many thanks, Piercarlo, for adding all those very interesting comments that I'm sure will be then rediscussed during our meeting. I would like, before giving the floor to our panelists, I would like to underline that this, as I said, this meeting is a part of a wider project aimed essentially at providing the Italian government with some suggestions and proposals in view of the Italian presidency of the G20 next year. And in this framework, we are addressing not only the issue of trade, but also other, I think, crucial issues of the G20 agenda, including digitalization, digital transformation, aging, and circular economy. Those issues will be the subject of other meetings. So this meeting is just the first of a series that will continue in the next week, and we will keep you informed, and we will invite you to take part in the next meetings. Of course, in identifying these issues and also the way in which to address them, so the specific angle from which we want to discuss those issues, we have been in close contact, have cooperated closely with the Prime Ministerial Office and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But also we are benefiting from the contribution of other think tanks and institutes that are directly involved in the in providing support and suggestion for G20, particularly within the framework of a context called T20, which is particularly important because it offers a forum and many opportunity for exchange of views between those study centers and think tanks. Concerning specifically the issue of trade, we would like essentially to address 5 main issues. First, the current trends, so an issue we have already mentioned, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on trade patterns, including particularly the supply and value chains, and how also these, the pandemic has impacted the protectionist drives. Second, the main challenges of global trade governance, and in this context, how the WTO crisis can be addressed in light also of the most recent initiatives undertaken to that effect. There have been indeed, I think, some interesting, don't say promising, but in any case, important initiatives promoted by, for instance, the EU and other actors. So it would be interesting to discuss this, how, if they may have the potential of advancing the prospects of reform. The third subject are the positions and proposals of the main actors, in particular the members of the G20, on those trade issues, in particular if there is room for convergence to implement a reform of trade governance at the global level and relaunch the trade liberalization agenda on the basis of a possible convergence of interest and position. And of course, in this framework, the role of the EU, we all know, could be particularly important. And I would say also the prospect of transatlantic relations is a matter of crucial interest for us. Fourth, the state of debate within the G20, which is closely related to the previous point. And then, of course, the possible specific proposals and suggestions that we may advance. Let me just inform you about the rules of procedures. As I said, there will be 4 introductory presentations. I would ask, if possible, all the panelists to stay within the time limit of 7, possibly 7, maximum 10 minutes, so that we can have enough time for Q&A, and then possibly a second round, very short, of course, a second round for each panelist. And so that said, of course, the general request is to turn the microphone off, so that this applies to all participants, of course. And then, without further ado, I'll give now the pleasure to give the floor to Clara Brandi, senior researcher at the German Development Institute in Berlin. She is the author the co-author, indeed, of the paper focused on specifically on the reform of the WTO, although the paper takes into account the general context of the trade, global trade governance. So it's a very comprehensive, I would say, paper, which also put forward several, in my view, very interesting proposals. So many thanks, Clara, for joining us, for providing this very interesting paper. And now the floor is yours.
A big thank you from my side. It's a pleasure to be here to present joint work with Axel Berger on WTO reform and the role of the G20. He would like to be here, but cannot, and sends his regards. Yes, so thank you very much for organizing this seminar. Thank you very much for inviting us to share our thoughts on the potential way forward for the G20 on this very important and challenging issue. So I will, try to be brief, say after a few introductory words, just a few, sketch very briefly the state of international trade cooperation, which I'm sure all of you are aware of, before shedding some brief light on key issues and the positions of major WTO members to show where reform issues are particularly contentious and in which areas we might see some hope for progress. I will then say a few words about the role of the G20 and discuss our ideas for the way forward. So very briefly, getting started. As we all know, discussions on reforming the WTO have become more intense over the last few years. And as mentioned earlier today, we've seen that the largely uncoordinated trade policy responses to the ongoing COVID crisis further highlight the need to really strengthen multilateral cooperation. So this is more urgent than ever. In 2018, the need for WTO reform was officially recognized by the leaders of the G20 at the Buenos Aires summit, and they committed to supporting the necessary reform of the WTO to improve its functioning. This was an official G20 commitment back in 2018. So the WTO reform agenda is very complex, as we also show in our paper, and there are stark differences between different countries on possible reform options. So the question is, how can reform processes be supported despite these challenges? And of course, one key forum to help facilitate WTO reform is the G20. So this is what will be at the center of this short input and is at the center of our paper. Concerning the state of international trade cooperation. So we all are aware of the fact that the WTO is currently being challenged by the greatest crisis since its foundation 25 years ago. And there are three main dimensions of these crises. First of all, the negotiation of new rules in the WTO has stalled, which makes it very, very difficult for the WTO, or impossible, to create new multilateral trade rules for current challenges like digitalization, among others. Secondly, over the last few years, new forms of protectionism have appeared and become more and more important. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for the WTO to deal with and curb these new forms of protectionism. There are many loopholes that have not been addressed so far. Thirdly, and this is of course a key issue right now, the WTO system for adjudicating trade disputes has plunged into a deep, deep crisis due to the recent US veto on appointing replacements for outgoing appellate body members. So a huge crisis of the trade dispute settlement mechanism. So going forward, I will now sketch the 5 key issues that we address in our paper that would be important to put the spotlight on when really thinking about reform issues in the WTO. The first issue, I will just briefly mention them, is dispute settlement, as I just mentioned. The second issue is the role and the status of developing countries in the WTO in the context of special and differential treatment. The third key issue is WTO transparency and notifications by WTO members. The fourth key issue is WTO committee work, so the working of all the different committees and bodies of the WTO. And last but not least, the fifth key issue are ongoing discussions on potential new WTO rules on digital trade, so e-commerce, also fisheries and industrial subsidies, as well as technology transfer. So a few issues where new rules are being discussed. So in light of the escalating challenges and crises of the WTO, there has been a recently intensified and growing debate on reforming the WTO and addressing these key issues. So I will say a few words about the different types of actors that have contributed to this debate on reforming the WTO. Numerous proposals for reform have been tabled and discussed in the WTO's General Council, and more than 40 WTO members have actually made reform proposals for ongoing discussions. Secondly, there are also informal clusters, such as the Ottawa Group, which includes the EU, an important player, as we discussed in the introductory statements, have also advanced the discussion on WTO reform. There are, thirdly, also trilateral meetings between, for example, the US, the EU, and Japan, as well as regional clusters such as the African Group, which have contributed and are contributing to discussions on reform options. And of course, last but not least, there's the G20. G20 reform was discussed during the G20 Japanese presidency in 2019. Reform proposals continue being discussed in the ongoing Saudi Arabian presidency, and WTO reform issues will most likely or can figure prominently on the agenda of the upcoming Italian G20 presidency next year. So in our paper, we analyzed the various different positions of the various different WTO members on the 5 key issues I highlighted earlier. And we analyzed the potential for compromise, but also the difficulties of reaching consensus on these issues. And we showed that many interesting reform proposals have been put forward by G20 members. Overall, our analysis of the various positions of WTO members, and I cannot go into the details here, on the multiple issues on the reform agenda, show that there are strongly different views across WTO member states. Strongly different views. So it is very difficult to move ahead. Very briefly, on dispute settlement, this is a particularly contentious topic, with the US remaining highly critical of an independent and judicialized dispute settlement system, and with the US so far having rejected all proposals for reform thus far that have been put on the table. So deadlock on this issue still. Secondly, the definition and status of developing countries in the WTO also remains highly controversial, with China, India, South Africa, all G20 members, among others, strongly rejecting the US proposal for reform. Thirdly, ongoing discussions on the new rules in the WTO that I mentioned are also heated, and it's very difficult to make progress or achieve consensus on these issues, even though the hope was that fisheries subsidies could be an issue that could be addressed by the multilateral trading system and WTO members in the near future. Yet, apart from these 3 types of very difficult key challenges, there are some less debated and more technical issues that might entail the potential to actually forge a compromise among WTO members and make some tangible progress on WTO reform. And these issues, these more technical issues, include transparency. So the rule that WTO members are supposed to notify trade measures to the WTO and making sure that the WTO works in a transparent manner, as well as committee work, as I said, the ongoing work by committees and other bodies of the WTO. So these are not the highly politicized issues that are usually at the forefront of the debate, but these issues, transparency and committee work, are important aspects of the WTO functioning. And if it is possible to forge compromises in these more technical areas, this can help to at least make some progress on WTO reform. And this progress seems more in reach than in other issues currently. And it's worthwhile pursuing and putting the spotlight on. In light of the contrasting views of WTO members and the very complex reform agenda, so the key question is how the process of WTO reform can be facilitated on these more technical issues, but also the big key issues that are very much politicized. And of course, the key question is which role can the G20 play in this context? G20 members have been actively submitting multiple proposals for WTO reform over the past few months. So they're very active in this ongoing debate on WTO reform. Of course, the G20's importance stems from the fact that it brings together leaders from economically significant countries, representing 80% of world trade and relevant international organizations. So the G20 is a key player that has clout in this issue area. And it brings together governmental, but increasingly also non-governmental and societal actors from traditional as well as from emerging powers. So a wide diversity of different actors being active in this context. Furthermore, the G20 is a dialogue-oriented forum that can operate relatively freely, irrespective of formal mandates or negotiating settings. And this could be a plus in certain ways. So this dialogue-oriented forum can hopefully be active in promoting WTO reform going forward. And my last point is then sketching out 3 ideas for the way forward. What is the way forward more concretely for the G20? And of course, it's difficult to really find a solution here for how the G20 can make a key difference, but it's worthwhile at least putting these 3 ideas on the table, discussing them, and I'm looking forward also to other experts' ideas on how to improve these proposals or complement them with other ways forward. So let me sketch these 3 ways forward as the basis for our further discussion. So first of all, G20 leaders can help to keep up the momentum for reform, for WTO reform. G20 leaders can really play a key role in keeping WTO reform high on the agenda. That's the first point. For example, the Italian G20 presidency could engage key stakeholders of the trading system, including relevant international organizations, in a dialogue. In doing this, in close coordination with the G20 Troika, the Italian presidency could actively propose a multi-year agenda to prioritize WTO reform over the next few years and presidencies. So really putting WTO reform high on the agenda. The Italian presidency could also, and should probably, include the G20 engagement groups in this dialogue. So T20, which was mentioned earlier, but also other engagement groups like V20 or L20 or others that are relevant in this area. And the presidency could seek the input of these engagement groups on substantive reform options to include more and more stakeholders in this process. One option in this respect is to initiate an eminent trade expert group that reports to the G20 on an annual basis on the process, to also make sure that we keep up the momentum for WTO reform. So initiating an eminent trade expert group that helps keep this issue high on the agenda. The second idea for the way forward is the following. The G20 can help to promote dialogue on WTO reform and on possible compromises across the different issue areas of WTO reform. So with all these various proposals on important issues being submitted by WTO to the WTO by members of the G20 members can of course play a role in helping to find compromise going forward. Convergence of different members' positions on single issues is in some areas possible, it seems, these more technical areas, but in others not very likely. So the question is, how can we move forward? And one way forward is to work towards bargains across different issue areas. And one of these bargains could involve, for example, special differential treatment for developing countries and this tricky issue of dispute settlement. So one possibility for making progress could involve a larger group of developing countries, building on offers by Brazil and also countries like South Korea, to relinquish their demand for special differential treatment, which is an important issue for the US, in exchange for US agreement on some sort of progress on the dispute settlement issue, for example, in terms of the nomination of new appellate body members or other reform issues. So the G20 can play a key role in facilitating discussions about such issue linkages. And this is just one example I mentioned. There are many other ways forward, of course, in order to help promote a systematic approach to WTO reform and help to really promote discussion across issue areas to increase chances of such linkages that might help to forge compromise. Last but not least, the third way forward for the G20 is to bring together different actors from the trade area, but also policy arenas other than trade, including the environment and health. we all know that more integrated and coherent policymaking is needed in view of the fact that a functioning multilateral trading system is very important and is also key for promoting achieving the SDGs. So trade in goods and services can be a key enabler of domestic growth, revenue creation, and of course, a key part of COVID recovery. It can help to diffuse environmental technologies. It can help to tackle global health challenges by providing better access to medical equipment. And the Italian presidency, in light of this, could consider engaging not only the relevant people working on trade, but also engaging environment and health ministers, finance ministers in the Italian government, but also across all G20 countries in discussing about Wto reform. One option could be joint ministerial conferences or joint deliverables of the various G20 work streams in order to create effective tools in promoting Wto reform. So joint ministerial conferences or joint deliverables across various G20 work streams also seem a promising way forward. And I'll stop here and thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the discussion. Many thanks.
Many thanks, Clara. And yes, your paper, I'd like to underline that is already ready now for the publication and will be published soon. I hope by the end of the month or in early August. And we will assure, of course, a broad dissemination, including, of course, among the participants in this meeting. I believe that the paper is indeed a very enlightening paper because combine an analytical examination of the main trade governance challenges with as we have already heard, a policy-oriented approach with also a detailed illustrations of the positions of the main actors. So it's worth reading. I would invite you to when it is published to have a look at it. Now I will follow an alphabetic order. So following the agenda and give the floor to Said Takman, Senior Research Fellow at the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, TEPAV, which is based in Ankara. Is all of you perhaps know already that it's most important Turkey study center dealing with trade matters. Said is also a director of G20 study centers at the institute. Is playing also a key role in the T20 activities that are being developed during the current presidency of G20, the Saudi Arabian presidency of the G20. Let me invite you and the other panelists to be a little bit shorter and stay within the time limit I have indicated. Otherwise, we risk not having enough time or substantial amount of time for the Q&A session. Said, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Greco. Buongiorno a tutti e grazie per avermi invitato a questo incontro webinar. I continue in English. The WTO currently faces an existential crisis, as mentioned beforehand, and especially calling for substantial reforming. And there had been a bombardment of reform proposals by major stakeholders as its main functions are becoming progressively ineffective. Its rules had hardly been adapted to global economic dynamics, and procedures with respect to rulemaking require some revisions beyond some low-profile deals. And second, the WTO's most successful leg so far, adjudicating trade disputes, now runs into difficulty, as explained by Clara. Its appellate body was diffused by means of the non-appointment of its members to fill the vacancies. And finally, third, is the new forms of protectionism is rising since the latest economic and financial crisis, taking new shapes. And all these challenges reflect confrontational issues embedded in a changing geopolitical landscape, particularly between advanced economies and other countries. Now we need a new rule book, actually, in line with the need to make the WTO more responsive to transformational developments, especially in the period where we also faces a COVID-19 challenge. And the major stakeholders already proposed many reform proposals. And out of these these proposals, let me make 3 points clear. That first of all, we need to curtail the divergences over key areas, key issues, as these issues were raised by Clara. The second is the multilateralism. It is still important, it still matters amidst rising trade protectionism and conflictual trade policy practices. And the G20 Italian presidency should, I believe, will prioritize the eminence of multilateralism. And the third point is the need for global leadership. I mean a collective action by all rather than just supplied by major stakeholders. So in this context, the role of G20 is quite important to provide a platform to identify and resolve some controversial issues and to provide some convergence on the hot issues. Second is the support for multilateral rules-based system by strengthening a mutual trust among the major players. And thirdly, the collective leadership the G20 could somehow provide in keeping the past successes of the WTO and in facing new challenges. So I come now to Berger and Brandy's paper, which is a very good paper, very well documents and outlines the proposals by over 40 members of the WTO over various issues, detailing a detailed approach, actually covering essential aspects raised in these proposals. And it really nicely elaborates many key and thorny issues, the positions of major stakeholders in very formidable areas. So it provides a clear argument about what the G20 potentially could focus in the next Italian presidency on promoting dialogue in WTO matters. Let me further elaborate some points about the paper. First of all, the paper mentions about adoption of new rules, has stalled, and the WTO rulebook is outdated. That's correct, but this is largely because the consensus decision-making is no longer operational under complex global economic context, under increasing number of stakeholders and complex domestic policy processes. So the paper largely refrained from touching upon this very thorny issue for understandable reasons, but starting with the agreements, some critical mass agreements are being discussed now, and then they could be gradually transformed into fully global agreements. This appears to be the most promising path to multilateralism of the future. So the plurilateral agreements, for example, requires more attention and consideration also during the next Italian presidency, especially in areas which, if they are ripe for negotiation and if multilateral agreement is less likely to become an option initially. The second point about the paper, it refers to some or recalls some earlier studies that correctly brought recommendations for challenging topics like Sutherland Report, Warwick Commission, ECB. They were all successful reports outlining challenges, but these initiatives were independently held so far or under WTO responsibility only. And Further investigation and expert group studies as proposed by Clara on WTO reform need to be undertaken under the G20 political patronage. Only this way the G20 members can adopt some of the recommendations that we as think tanks or experts propose. The third point is about the final three elements to improve communication and policy dialogue as discussed in the paper. Of these three elements, the first one was about the engagement with stakeholders. That's actually an important aspect that can be better done actually if the G20 can empower its trade and investment working group a clear and implementable mandate so it can expedite and prioritize major challenges to be addressed and to provide a roadmap with a clear and long-term work program for actionable proposals. Engagement with some other groups like T20 or B20 could be done through the Trade and Investment Working Group, which already started this year as far as I see. And the IWG, this group, can be assisted by some permanent subcommittees and consultative board for scientific issues. The second element was the issue linkage, a grand bargain. Clara mentions this is a good option. I appreciate, but it should acknowledge the difficulties as we experience when we have such a big issue linkage. It should not actually acknowledge the difficulties we experience by single undertaking in the Uruguay round or later. So sometimes very difficult to match the things. The example of SDT versus appellate body nomination, it may work between the US and developing economies, but it may not work between US and EU, both are advanced economies. The third element was the policy linkage, which is important because our trade policy is becoming too much mingled with other policy areas. That because a very important and that actually reminds me of a neglected function of the WTO, that is with a view to achieving greater coherence in the world economy, in global economic policy making. The WTO should cooperate with other international organizations or regimes, namely the World Bank, IMF. Now it's extending into issues like environment, health, and a strong mechanism is actually now required between WTO and other policy areas, policy silos, I should say, that another important element that G20 Italian presidency should consider. Finally, I come to my latest point on what happened during this year under T20 process in 2020, Saudi Arabian presidency. They had a task force on trade, investment, and growth, where I'm actually one of the co-chairs. And there had been more than 60 papers presented, and only a few of them have been selected. Some have been merged. The priorities of the G20 Trade and Investment Working Group were three actually, but one of them was very much relevant to WTO reform. And then T20 had its own priority topics, largely relevant to G20 priorities, including the strengthening of the WTO as a multilateral forum. And then under T20, in the next slide, we can see, if we can do it. Yes, 10 papers, 10 policy briefs, and the first two of them were mainly relevant to the need for the WTO reform, a very important topic high on the agenda of G20. Of these papers, in the next slide, we will see, the first one was the need for WTO reform, co-authored by me, Mr. Padoan, Mr. Botti, and others, Mr. Axel Berger. The second on the WTO was actually presented and written jointly by Axel Berger, Clara Brandi, and others. These were the two major policy briefs. Of these, the T20 at the end of the process is going to publish these papers with their recommendations. Only shorter versions, but longer versions will also be available. The T20, which these papers provide some clear insights also for the next presidency. The T20 Secretariat, in accordance with the priorities of the G20, Trade and Investment Working Group, have selected two key themes for its engagement group statement, for its official statement. The first one was about WTO reform, the topic that we are talking today. The second was on COVID-19 impact on trade. And the statement largely adopted recommendations by Policy Brief 1, which also incorporated views from Policy Brief 2 as well, under the title WTO Reform to further its functions through improved dialogue, where we provided almost 10 recommendations, concrete recommendations for the Saudi Arabian and next presidencies. So these are my brief views about the paper and also what is going on in the T20 process this year, which could shed light some information for the next Italian presidency. And thank you very much for the time being. Grazie.
Many, many thanks, Said, for first very incisive comments on the papers by Clara Brandi and Alex Berger. I would like to underline that both are researchers at the German Development Institute, which is one of our partners within the T20, and also for these very useful pieces of information on the G20 activity this year and what also the T20 is doing. We are part of some of the task forces, including the one focused on trade. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Marco Felisani, Deputy Director, Internationalization and Trade Policy of Confindustria, which is the largest business association in Italy, which has also been very active within the T20s, of course, following very closely the trade agenda of the G20. Please, Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this important discussion. And congratulations to Axel and Clara for that paper that is sharp and concise while it captures all most urgent issues and challenges. I do my best to be equally sharp and concise in my comments. First of all, what I'm reporting to you takes stock of discussions that Confindustria carried out at various levels. First of all, the European level, being Business Europe, very committed on the subject issues. And we also have an interesting dialogue at the international level within the so-called Global Business Coalition, which is the association that gather the business organizations of the G20 countries. Which brings me straight forward to what I suppose to be my conclusion, but I'm very happy to anticipate it. That means what Confindustria is doing in the framework of the G20 Italian presidencies. Please be assured that trade and investment will be, and the reform of the WTO is a very important part of the debate, will be tremendously high in the agenda of our B20, and we will do our best to deliver sound policy recommendations to the Italian presidencies while working in close interaction with them. Well, normally, traditionally, business the B20 manages somehow to go beyond politics in agreeing on shared solutions, then, and this must be clear, it will be up to governments to take our proposal on board. We will try to be as narrow, as precise as possible. This said, let me provide you with 3 very basic general remarks, trying to put some different perspective from the other interventions and tackling from a purely business angles of view. The first is that when we talk about trade and we talk about the WTO, some forgets that we're not talking about exchanges of goods and services and investments only. All or nearly all factors of business competitiveness are or are likely to be in the WTO agenda. If you look from competition to sustainability to digital to public procurement, so we're talking about something which is extremely relevant for business. The second remark is that the WTO is a giant member-driven organization that works on consensus, and all other organizations as such, she suffers of structural shortcomings that have a reflections that reverberates on business, particularly in a twofold dimension that I would like to share with you. On the one side, the interaction that business has with the WTO is very limited, is randomic, and basically intermediated, while it should be deepened and streamlined because business has a lot to provide to the WTO, helping, amongst other factors, the interests of the public opinion that has fallen sharply due to the stall of negotiations. On the other side, we need a revitalized WTO to revert the narrative on trade and to make aware the public perception that trade is not the cause of global inequalities, but it is rather a part of a large part of their solution. And this is extremely important. My third and last general remark is about time. I don't think we are running short any longer. I think that we have run out of time. A new Director General will certainly help, but it won't be enough per se. Let's be conscious of that. The next ministerial conference sounds to me as a last bell for the WTO. Therefore, a really extraordinary effort is needed. And I must say, with a little bit of regret, that when I took part to the last WTO public forum in October last year, I frankly did not perceive such an extreme sense of urgency, and this is worrying for us. Then I will use a few minutes, really few, to make some more specific remarks, building on what Clara and the previous speakers have already highlighted. Of course, getting out of the moving sense of the dispute settlement mechanism is a matter of survival for the WTO. The issue is technically very challenging, so I will not, and I can't elaborate any further on this. And I am very much agree that the divergences now amongst the various proposals tabled by members are wide. We can only be confident that the European Union will succeed in gathering enough of consensus with other major partners to advance. A second area of concern is a threefold areas. I put them all together, but they are all equally urgent. More flexible ways to negotiate, reforming and not reviewing the SCM's agreement, the subsidies and countervailing measure agreement, and identifying new criteria to award special and differential treatment can soon after the dispute settlement priority. Obviously I don't have time to go into details. Let me just say one word on subsidies that often involve SOEs, and we all know the trilateral discussions that is going forward within the the European Union, the United States, and Japan pointed out some ideas that business see with particular interest. I mention only two of them: the reversal of the burden of proof, and the other, the so-called general rebuttable presumption. When you tackle subsidies, these two elements are key for business, and those of you that were involved or took any interest in the debate that took place in 2015 about the so-called Section 15 of the Adhesion Protocol of China to the WTO, that was about the award of the status of market economy status, well, they will easily recognize that substantially we are still there. We are still searching for common criteria to be adopted to decide who and how operates in the marketplace according to market forces or for state-oriented purposes. Overcapacity was there at that time and is still there, and it will increase due to the crisis. Illicit trade practices were there and will increase as well. In a nutshell, the international community still lacks a whatsoever discipline on competition, and this is a major concern for us. But there is much more related to Europe. Those who had a look of the recent white paper of the European Commission, finally, the European Commission is finger-pointing subsidies going beyond the trade of goods, trying to reach out services, investments, and M&A, and that's good news. The point is now how to bring all this to multilateral level. That's a big challenge. I think I'm approaching the end of my intervention. A few things more on decision-making processes. Clara is right. These are less politically sensitive issues, but for business are essentials because we need a performing organizations. If there is not enough money, not enough resource, not enough skills within the committees and the secretariat, the WTO is condemned to be low performing and perhaps to vanish away, and the risk is very serious. Look at the DDA. Its failure dates back already or more than a decade, and the single undertaking and the consensus voting system have clearly proved to be unmanageable because both brings to paralyzing those vetoes. One good news is the approach undertaken with the commerce or the investments facilitation, the so-called sectoral plurilateral agreement. But to go forward, again, those negotiations will need a huge political support and a much better decision-making process. Just to take a few words on the decision-making processes, we think that an ad hoc committee representative of the broad WTO membership and chaired by the WTO Director General, who should be given more power, could be tasked with identifying market access priorities. I think that the deliberations of such specific committees should be taken by majority, and that the consensus method should be left, or it should become the rule, the general rule. A single word on trade policy review, as they are carried out today, are little or no useful at all. The WTO would need a permanent monitoring committee to identify trade barriers and solve potential conflicts. Business would also need a more accurate classification of non-tariff barriers and notification requirements should become so stringent that members would start finally to feel accountable, because the impression is that they do not feel that way. And additional resources should be devoted to internal data management and processing. If we want a performing organization, we should provide it with adequate means and tools. Chairs and committee now lasts only 1 year, too short time to undertake challenging negotiations. Their mandate should be made at least 2 years, renewable maybe 1 time to have continuity. And the very last word on budget, the organizations has grown up to 164 members, but the budget has not increased accordingly. The fee requested to less developed countries has diminished, but the demand, the request of operations within the Secretariat has increased. So there should be also a clear vision on how the budget of the WTO can ensure its functioning. I stop here, and I hope my audio has improved during my presentation. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mark, especially for, of course, having emphasized how important is the trade liberalization agenda for business activity, but also for emphasizing the sense of agency that we need to have, considering that the huge impact, the de facto paralysis of some functions of the WTO is having on economic activities. And I think it's also important to consider carefully also your comments about the need for the EU, not only to work for reviving or saving even the dispute settlement procedure, but also for the need to address other issues that are, of course, very important, including the problem of subsidies, the role of governmental companies, and also the special treatment for some countries like China. This is, of course, a controversial issue that the EU is interested in addressing, perhaps with different allies compared with those with which it is cooperating to save the dispute settlement procedure. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Giorgio Giovannetti, who is an economist, full professor at the University of Florence. Is one of the most prominent trade experts in Italy, and he has directed several important projects on trade and trade-related issues. Giorgio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And maybe because I'm the only university professor, Fabrizio has asked me to discuss the paper. So that's what I will do. I will actually discuss the paper. I think that the paper, I agree with Felizati that the paper is rich and is very well organized. It contained very useful information for policymakers because it details all the many proposals for the WTO reforms which have been put forward in the recent years by different countries and also by different groups of countries. And also because it highlights the potential for compromise, i.e. the little, I would say, room for an agreement. I found the table at the end of the paper particularly informative because they single out different issues and they list the reform proponents. They address in a very complete and satisfactory way, very specific issue. For instance, we already mentioned the dispute settlement, the special and differential treatment, the transparency. So you read this table, you go through the table and you learn so much that you feel you know. So you're really taken into the topic. So I think that for policymaking purpose, these tables are particularly useful. So I do believe that the paper can be a very good base for the Italian presidency of the G20 if they want to push for a discussion on the WTO reform. But the position of the US and the other main players is at the moment very distant, as highlighted also in Clara's presentation. And this raises a question. Is there enough room to reach a compromise? What kind of agreement can be found with active developing countries? In 2005, I was in the interministerial conference in Hong Kong, and already then, the most active members were India, Brazil, and Indonesia. The proposal of Clara of bringing together experts from different fields, I think is very interesting, but complicates things. The more players, the more requests, the lower the room to reach an agreement. We all agree on the fact that the WTO needs a reform. Felizati just said this is the last bell for the WTO. If we don't reach it, that's it. This is not an easy task. It was not before, but is even more challenging after the COVID emergency, as Minister Barrucco and Piercarlo Padoan have emphasized. Why there is such a need for a reform? Many things have been said, but mainly, I think the main reason is because the WTO has not adapted to the changes in the global environment, has not adapted to the growth of China and other developing countries, which was in part even facilitated by multilateral rules. It has not adapted to the relative decline of the economic and political power of the US. It has not adapted to the new form of fragmentation of production and global value chain. And as has already been mentioned by various interventions, global value chain require different rules, and especially the fragmentation of production means that the impact of any trade restriction is magnified, and therefore it becomes particularly important. So even before COVID-19, the world had changed and the WTO had not. Now the world has changed even more. Reform is even more compelling, but is also much more complicated. Why? Well, because countries started to appeal to national safety to ban export. We have seen the cases of medical products even in Europe. Countries start speaking about shortening the global value chain, making global regional, i.e. all to reshore or to transform, put the production places in Europe rather than in Asia, for instance, which I'm very much against, by the way. Protecting home consumers, and this is not just the US. I think there is a very useful database on protection measure that the International Trade Center in Geneva has put forward, because it's very interesting because it lists all the individual measures and it says when they've been taken, whether they've been whether still on or not. So I think the paper is very useful. It's a very good and informative survey, but lacks a discussion of some, in my vision, important issues. The issue should be addressed in the reform proposal, not to have a shaky WTO after the reform. So we should also think ahead. We cannot make a reform leaving things unsolved. And the paper lacks a prioritization of issues to be discussed on which is crucial to find an agreement. In other words, the paper is rich, but does not take position on which problem should be treated first. Marco Felizati suggested to prioritize those issues which are more relevant for firms. And this could be a way. But of course, we should account for the fact that priorities are different for the main players. For instance, China and US, which is obvious, or also groups of players. I'll try to list some of the important issues. Some of these have been touched upon in the papers, some other not, because as everyone said, the paper is very concise, so it cannot treat everything, the word on the WTO. One issue which is very important, and I think is at the core of the reform, is the relationship between developed and developing countries over the issue of development status. And the fact that many developing countries, China and India, for instance, defend their rights to have special and differentiated treatment in the traditional rules. And this is really at odds at the moment with the US policy stance. The issue of preferential trade agreement is also important. Piercarlo Padoan mentioned them somehow, and what he crucial here is the relationship between the preferential trade agreement and multilateralism, which is not clear. And the discussion in this issue at the theoretical level is high. There are several papers by Everett or Bernard Eukman that deal with this issue. One point here relevant is that the preferential trade agreement do discipline trade distorting instruments such as subsidies. And this is something that Piercarlo Padoan has already mentioned. On this, the WTO has to have a clear position. It's absolutely key. We cannot go ahead otherwise. Some other things have been mentioned, like the trade wars, China, US, obviously. But I think one thing which is very important, which has not been mentioned, is the lack of sanctions in many cases. Just to give you some numbers, there are $425 million of bilateral US-China exchange are subject to tariffs or other impediment to trade that violate the WTO rules. Now, both countries are member of WTO, no sanction. There is another S, silence instead. So instead of sanction, we have silence. These things are swept under the carpet. Different people have already mentioned before me the decision process at WTO. It's true that it's based on consensus, and this is good, but the timing of the decision is incredibly long. Therefore, many times, this makes decision useless. The negotiation process is cumbersome. Let me make an example. Imagine the EU commissioner is at the table with Minister of Trade of different countries, but then if anything exceeds his mandate, he has to go back to the individual minister of the individual EU countries to discuss whether they can go beyond his mandate. So basically what we have is like a three-step game, because the minister of EU countries involved are more than one usually in this deal. So first there is an agreement in a EU country, then between the EU countries, and then there is a mandate to the commissioner. And then the commissioner goes to the table. So this is very, very cumbersome. And I think, of course, the countries have conflicting interests at any step of the games. Everyone already mentioned the appellate body, so the veto of the US, so I'm not going to get into that, but that I think is also a crucial issue and is very important. Last, given the little time I have, is the election of the new director. And many issues need to be discussed and possibly not left to chance here. Yesterday, or the day before yesterday, the nomination closed. There is already a big difference. Azevedo was the only candidate. There are 9 candidates now. Yesterday there was or the day before, 3 women from Africa and Korea, and the other are men. The curriculum are very different. What are the issues we want to cover? What are the questions that arise here? Political experience is necessary or not? Or is it better that he or she is a good negotiator? Does he or she need a public profile? Where should he, she come from? A developed or developing countries? We have UK and Kenya, for instance, amongst the proposal. Should he, she be an economist or a lawyer? What is better for being a good director general in a moment like this one, where you need experience, you need to deal with people? Should he or she have a managerial experience? Of course, these questions don't really matter if the choice is made on skill and experience. And also, all the experiences can be useful and many decisions are made in a team. But the discussion at the moment is centered on whether there is a need for an alternation between developed and developing countries, whether regional diversity must be ensured, whether this should be the first time of a woman. And so the discussion has sort of been also, and this has been cut down now, whether the director should not be a citizen of US or China because of the trade war. And as a matter of fact, there is no proposal of US or China. So that is actually fairly important. The only one of the main players is the UK proposal, which could be interesting because of Brexit. Now, of course, I will be in favor of having a woman, possibly from Africa, but I think the choice that will start next week will have to be done really not on citizenship. I don't think citizenship should matter. It's not that because you're a citizen in a country, you should favor your country or the similar countries. So I think it's very, very important that it's done really on the skill that we need for a new director general in this very moment. So some of the compromising ability of women can actually help. Anyway, let's see how it goes and whether the new Director General will be in charge of reforming the WTO. As we said, the time for reform is obviously going to be much longer than the time of the elections. Now, I want to close with a question which is not dealt with the paper, and is what are the implications of the WTO reform? I think we should also keep in mind that when we are proposing, especially if the government of Italy wants to propose, to discuss, to go further in the reform, is very, very important to look ahead. We shouldn't be short-sighted. That's the problem many times political decisions have, is not to look ahead. So of course the crisis of WTO puts all the member interests at risk. And so the proposed reform represents the attempt to rescue the organization. This organization that has been celebrated as one of the best institutions in global governance in the contemporary era. So I think it's particularly important that we keep that. And I think it's particularly sad that we cannot agree between developed and developing countries, between representatives on the basic criteria. Why is this so controversial? One of the reasons is because so far small countries have been penalized, and small countries are the one that depends more on a global value chain to integrate in the international economy. So the main issue I think that should be dealt, which should be thought, is on the implication of the reform of the WTO is who are going to be the winner and the loser for the reform. That's the only way that we should afford a discussion. And of course, I continue to support multilateralism. I'm very much in favor of the WTO, a reformed WTO. And I strongly believe that the decision process should be fastened in the WTO. Thanks.
Many, many thanks, Georgia. I think we have all appreciated your suggestion to adopt a far-sighted approach, and also to give adequate attention to tricky devising issues, including some that I would say political issues, more not necessarily technical, and also to try to fix some priorities which may, of course, be helpful to advance possibility of reforming the WTO. Now we have a fairly limited time for Q&A, but I would ask the audience or participants if they are interested in asking questions or intervene in the meeting. So you can do that, I think, by using the raise the hand function, and I will see it in the chat. So if you want to ask question, please do that.
Ettore, sorry if I interrupt you just while we are waiting for a question from the audience. If it is possible to give the floor to Simone Romano, that is participating at this webinar. Dr. Romano is advisor at the G7 G20 unit and of the office of the Italian Prime Minister, and he can provide us with the perspective of the presidency. Do you think it is possible to do it now?
Yes.
Or
Yes,
okay.
Simone
Romano.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio, and a quick thought about this. First of all, I mean, working to the Sherpa office of the diplomatic advisor of the Prime Minister, I want to thank IAI, all the other think tanks, and the people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, obviously the authors, professors like Giorgio Giovannetti, friends like Marco Felisadi, who have contributed to this. As you can imagine, is not an easy period for us because we are rewriting all our priorities after the COVID-19. So all the contributions are much appreciated. So thank you above all for the quality of this. just 1 minute because we are already running out of time. To some points, we absolutely understand what Carla, Saif, and Marco said, for example, about the urgency and about the importance of the G20 as catalyst of the dialogue. For this reason, for example, we are absolutely looking with very close attention to the Riyadh initiative, because in the Troika, the Saudi presidency has already launched this kind of attempt, you know, to catalyze some of the dialogue, some of the proposal outside WTO in the G20 to see if we can start agreeing on some even technical points. So obviously we want to see how this goes, and as you can imagine, we have even to understand a bit more the geopolitical situation when we take the presidency from the 1st of December. But absolutely, this, I agree, this can be the role of the G20. And another important point that was raised by many of you is to bring on board the civil society. And I can assure you that will be a key point in all the themes of the presidency, from the G20, W20. And just to give you an example, being the international landscape so, how can I say, fluid and difficult to read at the moment, but we are already processing some practical ideas to solve some trade issues. And one of them is bringing on board by the B20, I know that Marco Perisati already knows it, is the, for example, how can I say, a proposal for an international passport, a global value chain passport for small and medium enterprise who have been hit very hard by the crisis and who have to be, how can I say, to support a lot of administrative burden to get access to trade finance. And so we are very interested in this idea that is bringing about by the B20, now is in the B20 in the Saudi presidency, but we are very interested on this, and we are already working on this. So just to let you understand that all this kind of efforts from the civil society is very important for us. Except that, I just leave the floor to the others. I don't want to hog the conversation, but thank you again, and we are listening very closely to all these kind of suggestions.
Many thanks, Simone. Now, unfortunately, I've been asked to close the meeting as soon as possible for technical reasons. So, unless there are other questions, I see now a question from Alice Minati. Mrs. Minati, are you able to speak?
Yes, yes. Sorry, I wrote the question now. Well, thank you for the great event, first of all. And I would like just to ask, because I'm working, studying about the new carbon border adjustment mechanism at the EU level, that is within the next generation EU plan just proposed this week, or last week, yeah, sorry. As Dr. Paduan said, it is one of the measures that could really potentially unify Europe, also giving access to new resources, and confirm as well the EU leadership in fighting climate change. But I was I was wondering if this mechanism, this initiative could be contentious at the international level, especially at the WTO, given the trade war and well, the acceptance of this mechanism for US and China. And since the EU is promoting multilateralism, I was wondering why, if this measure could be acceptable at the international level, because it can go, well, it creates contentious between the trade partners. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks. So now I am obliged, unfortunately, to give the floor for the last word to Clara Brandi. Clara, just for a short reply, and then my colleague Fabrizio Botti will say some final words. Clara,
yes.
Please. Yes.
Many thanks for having a few words. I will keep it short. Yeah, I would like to thank thank the other panelists for their excellent inputs, for taking debate further from the perspective also of the T20, of the B20 and the business world, and from a more academic perspective, providing more insights on this very tricky and complex issue of Wto reform and how to go forward and what kind of role the G20 would play. And I agree very much with the common trust that we need to make very sure that we prioritize going forward, we prioritize the key issues we think through in terms of the longer term implications of these reform options. And that, yes, the COVID crisis makes reform even more important, but also more tricky. In terms of carbon border adjustment, I think that's a very interesting question. I think it's a bit beyond what we can discuss now, but I've actually worked on a T20 policy brief that takes up this issue, so I'm happy to send you the link for this brief. I think the EU proposal is very interesting. Of course, it's contentious. I think it will be very important to have a strong international dialogue on this issue, a lot of transparency on this issue on the EU part, and a lot of trust building. And perhaps the G20 can even play a role in promoting some sort of dialogue, accompanying dialogue on this issue for the EU and other countries interested in these kind of measures. Yes, so very many challenges ahead, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing how the G20 presidency will be unfolding this year, but also next year with the Italian presidency taking over. So many thanks for all your excellent inputs, for organizing this very interesting seminar, and I look forward to being in touch on these issues.
Many thanks, Clara. And now, Fabrizio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ettore. First of all, I would like to express the gratitude of the Istituto Affari Internazionale to all the speakers for their very valuable and inspiring contribution. It's not an easy task for me to drop up all these rich and comprehensive interventions. I try to do my best, and I'm sure you will excuse me if I'm too synthetic in the account. As it was repeatedly stated by the panelists since the initial speech from the Minister Barucco and Onorevole Piercarlo Padovan, several processes and factors, I may say, are making the current phase both a threat and opportunity for global cooperation on trade issues. And most of these trends mounted in recent years before the pandemic, and such evolution weakened the existing global trade architecture and generated widespread discontent with trade rules and systems, and especially the WTO, who somehow responded or adjusted poorly to these new trade-related challenges, and with its main function becoming progressively less effective. The COVID-19 crisis, tremendous impact on world trade and the spread of protectionist measures from, as we saw in the wake of global health emergency, export restriction, other trade barriers to medical supplies, medicine, food, and other goods may exacerbate these negative effects on global trade and production. So any delay in building a new innovative global trade system with a reformed WTO may risk to favor the development of uncoordinated, unilateral, or bilateral initiative, leading to an even more profound crisis of the WTO, or even a collapse of the current trade governance system. The G20 potentially play a very crucial role that springs from being an informal forum that is oriented to dialogue between the most important countries. All of you knows G20s account for 80% of world trade, so that's the crucial role that the G20 can play. The paper presented by Clara Brandi today, a joint work with Axelberger, both at the German Development Institute, not only offers us a comprehensive account of overview of the state of international trade cooperation, the position of key stakeholders and key issues, but they propose a very focused and operational proposal for the Italian presidency of the G20, because it combined the strength of the G20 as an informal forum and the WTO key position as a discussion forum for reforms. Said Akman highlighted the crucial role of the engagement groups, especially the T20, and reporting us on the activity of the T20 at the Saudi Arabia T20 2020, and the results achieved at the Task Force on Trade, Investment and Growth in effect the T20 statement on WTO reform, and hopefully the G20 Saudi Arabia policy making. Dr. Felisato of Confindustria provided us the perspective of the Italian business community, and something here I liked that really interesting, it was the so far limited interaction between the WTO and business, and also the underlying the potential of an improved or revamped relationship between the two. Also providing us a perspective of the B20, that is another important engagement group in the G20 process. Professoressa Giovannetti of the University of Florence, of course, provided us an academic perspective, but especially a precise and very informative review of the paper of Berger and Brandi, underlying the possible potentials, but also constraints of the policy recommendation that has been made, and so important insight and implication for the Italian presidency. Especially on a key issue, one key issue, the problems in the formation of European trade-related collective action. That is something that we need to take into consideration, and left us with a question that is worthwhile to develop further and consider when we explore all the proposals for a reform of the WTO. What are the implications of the WTO reform? So let me finish with a few words. Our ambition is that this debate and this research-based recommendation could be of support also for all the actors that are involved in the preparation of the agenda of the Italian G20, with the final aim to improve multilateral cooperation and, of course, global well-being. Now that the webinar is finishing, let me just remind you that next week, the 16th of July, still in the framework of this project supported by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and the Compagnia di Sanpaolo, Istituto Affari Internazionale is promoting another webinar on the challenges of digitalization and the role of the G20. I hope you have time and the opportunity to participate. I'm sure you easily find information through our website, newsletter, and social media. In any case, do not hesitate to contact us for more information. Now the webinar is finished. Thank you very much. Have a good day and a good lunch. Thank you.